So welcome everyone to session 4 of macroeconomics exercise class. We would look at ISLM model and graphical analysis. The first part would be expansionary fiscal policy in the ISLM model. The second part in this part of the video would be contractionary fiscal policy in the ISLM model. The first problem of our session 4 is expansionary fiscal policy in the ISLM model, which investigates the magnitude of the shift. As you have already seen earlier in session 3, we have defined IS curve and LM curve using these two formulas that are displayed. For simplicity, we have set the price level to be 1, so we had M over P is equal to dO plus D1 multiplied by Y minus D2I, but for simplicity, we have set P to be equal to 1, so we are only having M in the LM representation. The numerical values are given for each variables and each parameters in the formula. The question here is which curve shifts when the government spending increases. Compute by the total differential the horizontal shift of this curve when government spending is increased by 10 units. So we have said that the government spending is only implicated in our goods market, so therefore our IS curve shifts. That is the first answer to the question which says which curve shifts. The first answer is IS curve shifts because IS curve is implicated in the government spending. When government spending is increasing, our investment saving curve is impacted because our government spending is impacting the goods market. And the magnitude of shift of IS curve can be calculated by the total differential. We start with the already given formula of the IS curve, which says y is equal to CO plus C1 y minus t plus B0 plus B1 multiplied by y minus B2I plus our government expenditure G. First, we would get rid of the bracket in the right-hand side equation plus B0 plus B1y minus B2I plus G. And then the second step we do is we would gather out y terms and we would move them to the left-hand side. So we would subtract from both sides C1 multiplied by y plus B1 multiplied by y. So this would give us y minus C1y minus B1y would be equal to CO minus C1t plus B0 minus B2I plus government expenditure G. If I take y as a common here, I would have a bracket term which says 1 minus C1 minus B1, and the right-hand side equation remains the same. And if I divide both sides by 1 minus C1 minus B1, this term would cancel out with this one. I would be left with y in my left-hand side, and on the right-hand side I would have 1 over 1 minus C1 minus B1 multiplied by CO minus C1t plus B0 minus B2I plus government expenditure G. Now we have said that we would need to take the concept of total differential to identify by how much the IS curve would shift if the government spending is increased by 10 units. So I would take the total differential, which can be written as dy is equal to 1 over 1 minus c1 minus b1 d of co minus c1 multiplied by dt plus d of bo minus b2 multiplied by di plus dg. So here the information that we are given is regarding the increase of government spending. So our other terms of d of co would be equal to d of tax, would also be equal to d of I, and would also be equal to db0. All are going to be equal to 0 because none of them are said to change. They are actually constant. The only thing that is changing in our case is our government expenditure dg. So in our case, we would have dy is equal to 1 over 1 minus c1 minus b1 multiplied by the dg, which is the change in government expenditure. And we are asked to identify by how much our income would change, that is to say, what would be our dy if our government expenditure changed by 10 units, that is to say, if dg is 10. So we would calculate dy is equal to 1 over 1 minus c1 from our table is given to be 0.75. And b1 from our table is given to be 0.05, and we are saying that if our government expenditure changed by 10 units, that is to say our dg is equal to 10. So this would give you all in all 5 multiplied by 10, which would be 50 units. So we are saying that if government expenditure increased by 10 units, our income would be increasing by 50 units, which is in other words saying that the IS curve would shift by 50 units to the right. The second part of this exercise is graphically analyze the effect of an expansionary fiscal policy, which is represented in this case by increasing government expenditure, or it can also be represented by the decrease in tax in the ISLM model. Furthermore, also respond to the phenomena of interest-induced crowding out of investment in your figure and discuss the phenomena verbally. So we would start with a graphical analysis of this scenario. For that, we have already identified our ISLM curve. The labels are already indicated. In our initial equilibrium point A, we have an income level of YA in a usual scenario, as indicated also in the previous cases. We would have an initial level of income YA and an initial level of interest rate IA. So we are saying in our case that the government expenditure increased, and we have already mentioned that this is reflected in our IS curve. So our IS curve would have to shift outside to the right by 50 units as we have just calculated. So we would have a new IS curve of IS1. And we would have a new equilibrium point of point B with a corresponding income amount of YB, and again a corresponding interest rate amount of IB. So, as we have said, an expansionary fiscal policy can be performed by an increase in government expenditure G or by a reduction in taxes T. So both of these actions by the government would shift the curve outwards to the right. So this is to say our IS curve shifted from IS0 to IS1. The income had increased because of this government expenditure increase, because we have YA initially and our new income is YB. An increase in income raises also the money demand, because an increase in income indicates that there is an increase in aggregate demand, and our money demand is part of our aggregate demand. So if aggregate demand increases, there is also an increase in money demand. Because of the increase in money demand, an interest rate would also increase. We have already seen that if there is an increase in money demand, people would want to sell their bonds, and if they want to sell their bonds, there would be an excess supply of bonds on the market. If there is an excess supply of bonds in the market, there would be a low price of bonds, and if there is a low price of bonds, we have said there is an inverse relationship between low price of bonds and an interest rate. So the inverse relationship would indicate that interest rate would raise. So that's why we have now a term to say we have an increase in interest rate from IA to IB. Because of these high interest rates, there should be a decrease in investment, because high interest rates would not motivate too much investment. So this increase of interest rate would result in a decline in investment, and this decline in investment is called interest-induced crowding out of investment. To explain that, let's just keep the interest rate at point A. If we had fixed the interest rate at point A, we would have got a new point, which is A prime in our case, and we would have a new interest rate which is equal to IA, but we would indicate it as IA prime. So at this point we would have had a new income level of YA prime. If we had an interest rate fixed at point A or an interest rate fixed at point IA, we would have reached a level of income which corresponds to YA prime, which is actually higher than both of these incomes indicated. However, at our new equilibrium point B, we are having an income which is equal to YB. So this is to say a higher investment, a higher interest rate from IA to IB decreased investment. So the decreased investment is here indicated by the decrease in the income from Y prime to YA. So this green arrow in our curve indicates the interest-induced crowding out of investment on income. To summarize, we had an expansionary fiscal policy by way of increasing government expenditure or decreasing tax. We are talking about fiscal policy, so we have shifted our IS curve from IS0 to the new IS curve IS1. For IS1, we had a new equilibrium point of point B, which is having a higher income, but still again, it is having a higher interest rate. This higher interest rate is motivated by the higher money demand, which resulted in the increase from the aggregate demand. And if we had kept the interest rate at the initial equilibrium level of point A, we would have had a higher income of YA prime, which is actually the greatest of all the three incomes involved here, YA and YB. But since interest rate increased from IA to IB, we had seen that this would indicate a decrease in investment, which is called interest rate induced crowding out of investment. Because of this investment, we have a lower income YB in compared to YA prime. The third part of this expansionary fiscal policy in the ISLM model is to explain the dynamics in the model by using scheme of arrows. So here we have to assume that the ISLM model is the model of a model of underemployment, and basically companies can increase their prices or increase their production while facing the excess demand from the economy. So here we are only considering an increase in production. So if we have an increase in government expenditure or a reduction in taxes, we are having a resulting impact of an increase in aggregate demand. So aggregate demand would increase. This would indicate that our aggregate demand would be greater than our aggregate supply. If aggregate demand is greater than our aggregate supply, this would indicate that our income would be higher, so we would have an increase in Y. This would again translate to consumption, which is a positive function of our income. So consumption would increase even higher than the income, which would again lead to an increase in income. So this increase in income can also be indicated in the money market. So we would write the spillover to the money market. We would again start with an increase in income. If income increases and if aggregate demand increases, aggregate demand is also incorporating money demand. So this is to say, if aggregate demand increases, money demand would also increase. If money demand is increasing, this is again to say money demand will be greater than money supply. If there is a high demand for money in the market, there would be also an increase in bond supply in the market. Bond supply would be high. There would be an excess bond supply in the market, which indicates that bond supply would be greater than bond demand. In a normal economic scenario, if supply is higher than demand, the price of bond should reduce. And this reduction of price, having an inverse relationship with the interest rate, would lead to an increase in interest rate, which again leads to a reduction of money demand until we reach money demand is equal to money supply. The spillover of this increase can also be indicated in the goods market. So we have said that our interest rate is increasing. If interest rate is increasing, having seen the formula for our IS curve, this is again to say this entire term would be decreasing because we have here a negative sign. So this would again reflect to be aggregate demand would decrease, and this would again reflect to be aggregate supply is greater than aggregate demand, which all in all would lead to a reduction in income. So as we have seen, overall there will be a slowdown of income as a result of expansionary fiscal policy in the ISLM model.